Ellen Gabriel. Yep, she's one of our heroes. Okay, but for those of you who don't know very much about her, let me introduce her. Ellen is of the Turtle Clan and from the community of Magna Quebec, and she was chosen by the people of the Longhouse and her community to be their spokesperson during the 1990 siege of Kanesatake, or what is popularly known as the 1990 Oka crisis. Hopefully there are people in the room who lived through that. Yes, all right. This siege occurred in order to protect the Pines from the expansion of a 9-hole golf course and luxury condominium development in Kanesatake. For the past 25 years, Ellen has continued to work diligently as a human rights and environmental advocate for the collective and individual rights of Indigenous peoples, and as an educator to the public on the history, cultures, and identities of Indigenous peoples. Ellen is also the former president of the Quebec Native Women's Association and is currently a cultural consultant for the Kanesatake Language and Cultural Center. She continues to remain a vigilant advocate for gender equity, justice for murdered and missing Indigenous women, the revitalization of Indigenous languages, cultures, and traditions, as well as Indigenous people's rights to self-determination. So please welcome Ellen Gabriel.
What can we do? Konwarátolni, Gwenny ez kungaraki, Saudi Serata, again part, and hope you body hope in a Bomoa. That's exactly what's going to just an organiato, can you go out and again to the Mr. can I get a Norad and a book with one. It's Norad and the Eastern himself and it's still Norad and there's work this one. That's what's necessary. So I would like to thank Winnie again for inviting me to Ryerson here this evening. It's a great honor to be with you and to still be asked after, actually it's 26 years of doing this kind of work. And I'm Turtle Clan from the oldest community of the Ganegahagan people of Kanesatake, which is 62 kilometers northwest of Montreal. We're not the bridge, we're the golf course. And I wanted to acknowledge also the elder with the good words that she gave us to open up our evening, and to thank all the natural life forces, Mother Earth and all our relations for all that they give us. And our custom in the Iroquois nations, the Udinusestage, Udinusuni, the people of the Longhouse, before we start anything, we talk about that's the word said before all else. And the reason why we do this is exactly what we're talking about today, is to acknowledge all those things that help us live, even down to the smallest insect, which we know, for example, the honeybees are endangered because of pesticides and all those kinds of things that we're using to make sure that we have food on our table. What an irony of that. And so I want to acknowledge all our relations, from the waters that give us life, Mother Earth, who nourishes us, to up in the heavens. Tom was talking earlier about ceremonies, and for us in the springtime, the first time we hear the thunderers, the grandfathers come, there's a ceremony for them. Because in our traditions, in our stories, we are told that the thunderers keep those dangerous spirits, those things that would harm us, underneath the ground. They scare them and they throw their lightning bolts down to keep them under the ground. And for us, the sun is our elder brother. And the elder brother, of course, we could not live without. Whether we think about it today as vitamin D for our bodies, to keep us healthy, to making the plants grow, and all our relations as well, for the food that they eat. In our creation story, the first two human beings on this planet of water were women. We come from the sky world. And the first woman that came here, was the one who created all the things that we're seeing. She sprinkled things down on the turtle's back, and things started to grow. And she was pregnant. And she gave birth to a daughter. And that daughter was her companion for the longest time until she was older. Her daughter started wandering around, and she became pregnant. And again, I have to warn you that there's 125 odd stories of the creation story. So in the version that I know, it's the west wind that got her pregnant. And she had 2 boys. And so those boys, those twin boys, were the ones that also added to what she created. And so in the people of the Longhouse, women are the title holders to the land. Women are the ones responsible for the land. And as we know, in the womb, there's water. And that water is what keeps that baby from friction, right? That holds the baby. And even in our brains now, as you're sitting there, our brains are floating. So water is such an important part of who we are, that when trauma happens to us, it changes our chemical composition. And I'll talk about that in a little bit later on. But that's part of who we are as Ogbonge people. And Ogbonge people are called the real human beings. And I won't go into that, there's not enough time tonight to go into what that means. But this is part of who we are as the people of the Longhouse. And it's not a building, it's not like a church, it's not like anything like that. The east where the sun rises is the eastern door, and the earth is our floor, and the sky is the roof. And where the sun sets is the western door, is that other door. And so it's all about being part of that creation that Sky Woman brought to us from another world. And they say that Sky Woman was godlike. And they say that the people who were there were human-like. And I often wonder how much of those gifts that we could have had many, many generations ago are not being used. You know, they say we only use, I don't know, a small percentage of our brain, right? Did we ever use 100%? We don't know. But it's time that we start using that part of the brain we're not using right now. Which means making that commitment to those babies, those little ones right now, to make sure that they don't have such a big mess to clean. And for their children to be able to enjoy what we enjoy today. And Tom was talking about one day of shutting down the system. Perhaps in the summer there can be a week long of no barbecues. Because it's the gas. The gas that we enjoy our hamburgers and hot dogs on is the gas that is taken from the earth. And that's fracking. And we need to think about, as Tom said, our consumption. The late Seneca scholar John Mohawk had said, colonization interrupts the patterns of learning to survive and substitute it to learning to serve. For many generations, the settlers have wanted us to become like them or to become subservient to them. Many generations have resisted colonization. Many generations have resisted assimilation. And today you see the result of that resistance in places like Standing Rock, in places like Ipperwash, and those who are fighting against the oppressors, of those who have contaminated and polluted our waters and our environment, the 1% of the 8% that we see now vying for the role of President of the United States. And property rights and property law in Canada and the US is based on terra nullius. There has been no repeal by Canada or the US to repeal the doctrines of superiority which have been condemned by the United Nations, which they themselves are a part of. They did not consider our ancestors human beings. In fact, we were called pagans, and if we could not be converted, we would be enslaved or killed. After 1 century of contact with Europeans, 3/4 of the indigenous population throughout the Americas were dead by war and disease. And so, how much traditional knowledge did we lose? How much stories did we lose? And that's why I believe that Indigenous people are still grieving those losses, those centuries of genocide, which is the basis and the foundation of Canada and the US and all those countries in the Americas, and all those rich European countries who have profited from the blood of the Indigenous peoples being spilled, including the Vatican, the richest state in the world. Ganesadaga, where I come from, was rich in biodiversity. We farmed nuts, fruits, all kinds of squash, corn. We even had wild rice. And that was quickly destroyed when the Sulpician blue bloods from France came with Christian Mohawks, Nipissings, and Algonquins in 1721, in the dead of winter, to the community of Ganesadaga, because they knew that they would be cared for and spared. And they used the doctrines of terra nullius to give themselves the land and to protect the settlers and reward those Indigenous people who would be Christianized. And today we see that. We were talking over supper with Shelley and Tom about how this paramilitary force came into the sweat lodge and busted the sweat lodge up, broke the pipes, roughed up the elders who were conducting the sweat. Which means in this day and age, in 2016, there is no freedom for Indigenous people to continue practicing their customs. That is genocide. Genocide is being practiced, and as Tom said, is fed to its citizens as something that's a normal thing to do to Indigenous people. Oppression has been normalized into the legislation, into the education, and into the very daily lives of culture in the Americas. There have been recent progressions and accomplishments for Indigenous people's rights to be protected. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is the most comprehensive international human rights instrument that is now a consensus document. There is no state in the world that opposes it. Within it, there is free, prior, and informed consent. And none of the countries practice this at all, in spite of their own legislation. In Canada, the Supreme Court has told the government that it must uphold the duty of the Crown and act honorably in its dealings with Indigenous peoples. The present government, under Justin Trudeau, promised to implement the Declaration. But like someone who's caught in the corner, they are trying to squeak by and say if a community is interested in opting out of the Indian Act, they can implement the Declaration with a self-government agreement. And a self-government agreement also includes giving up the right to your land, which also has been criticized by the United Nations. It's extinguishment of title. And so nothing has changed. Again, as Tom has said, it's the Matrix telling you to swallow the red pill and become numb to actual justice for Indigenous people. So we see colonization as one of the threats to Indigenous peoples. And you see Tom and I and Shelley and all the other Indigenous people, we're here of our free, there's nobody stopping us from coming here. So you must be wondering, how does colonization affect us? We talk about colonization, but I don't know how many people actually understand what a threat it is to the very identity and survival of Indigenous peoples. The Indian residential school kidnapped children, and we are still grieving the losses of those, 3,000 children that never came home. I don't know what the number is in the United States. We are still grieving the loss of the murdered and missing Indigenous women whose lives were just marginalized by the policing authorities, of whom now this commission wants the families to go to. The one that Amnesty International and the Native Women's Association of Canada said were part of the problem. That colonization is the problem. It's rooted in the racism and the systemic discrimination and racism that is practiced by Canada today. And colonization affects us because even though you have band councils, which is an imposed system of, I won't say governance, because it's not even governance in my community, it's just administering different services for education, for health. Because at the end of the day, it's the Minister of Indian Affairs, and I'll call it Indian Affairs because we still have Indian status legally under Canada. It's only if Canada approves any kind of bylaw that a community, Indigenous community creates, that it becomes actual law. It's still under the colonial terms. It's not under our terms. And we never gave up that right to sovereignty. That Okwahua women, the Longhouse women I know, we never sold our land. We never gave up that right. And the languages that our ancestors spoke are still being spoken today, but they are being threatened. UNESCO said Indigenous languages are most threatened in Canada. One of the richest countries in the world is oppressing the languages of the First Peoples of this beautiful Turtle Island. And we didn't come from the Bering Strait, although people say that, there must have been traffic going both ways. But our stories tell us we are Indigenous to this land. We didn't come over by boat. We didn't come over by plane. We are from this land. We grew from this land. We were nurtured from this land. And the water and its resources, and the animals that fed us, and they clothed us. And I am so grateful that they still continue to do that for us. And it's in that spiritual being of those relations that we have forgotten as the real human beings. We are torturing the animals that we eat. We are torturing and taking away the habitats of those animals that cannot speak, that cannot go to court to say, hang on, this is my family, this is my people's land. Those animals and those relations can't say that. Those medicines cannot speak. So it is our obligation to do that. Yeah. Human rights. We talk a lot about human rights. In 2009, Bolivia, because the UN didn't want to do it, Bolivia created their own conference on the environment, and they came out with this declaration on the rights of Mother Earth. I don't know, Tom, if you remember that. And it came from a country which is predominantly indigenous. And it is dismissed by those progressive, so-called progressive people at the UN. And when we talk about human rights, we need to talk about a gender-based, an equally balanced base of decision-making. Margaret Wallström, who is at the UN, talked about the disaster that is happening, the natural disasters which are increasing in intensity. They've always been there. We've always had hurricanes, we've always had earthquakes, but they are intensifying because Mother Earth has a fever caused by us. But she said, you cannot just have one part of the community, in this case men, to design how things happen. Because then you are inefficient and are not optimizing your resource base. Today, I think young women don't realize the work that was done by feminists earlier on. You need to understand and just look at popular culture and you'll see the commodification of women's bodies continuing today. And at the bottom of that rung is Indigenous women. And it's okay to do what you want to Indigenous women. And I don't care about this commission that's coming up. Canada was told a long time ago, and I know in the US there was the Maze of Justice by Amnesty International America. Canada knows what to do. We don't need another commission. We have the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. Volumes and volumes of the story of colonization and how it has oppressed Indigenous people. What is the opposite of oppression? Anybody? It's love, compassion. It is freedom. It is justice. It is the right to be happy. It is the right to feel free to be who you are. Whether you are straight, bisexual, two-spirited, transgender, it is that right. And for Indigenous people, it is the right to be who we are, to practice our traditions, to practice our languages, to teach our children our history, our legends, our creation stories, with our ways, according to our standards, not the colonizer's standards. Years ago, I stood with other women, 13 of us, to meet a police force that is probably no different than the one that we saw hundreds of years ago if we went to travel back in time. We were not armed. And the men who had weapons pointing at our heads and our hearts were shaking. And it began a 78-day siege, 2 days longer than Wounded Knee, but a 78-day siege where our fundamental human rights were violated. And to this day, no one has been accountable or answerable to them. And last year, it's almost to the day, 7 brave women in the city of Val-d'Or, Quebec, made public the Sûreté du Québec officers raping them and abusing them. And today they are still suffering the consequences because the police are harassing every Native woman in that city. The government of Quebec has stated during 1990 they could not control the Sûreté du Québec. And to today, in 2016, they still cannot control it because they are passing their responsibility in protecting the public to a commission who has no mandate whatsoever to oblige the police to act responsibly and to be held accountable for the violation of human rights and the rape of innocent women. It is Canada's shame, and next year, when Canada is celebrating 150 years of its statehood, I and many others will not be celebrating it. Noam Chomsky said, the biggest threat to the world population is global warming and nuclear weapons. Imagine if we were having Putin and Trump decided one day that they were going to have an argument and they're both, their hand is on that little red button. As someone had said earlier, we all are on this Mother Earth. And we all will have to bear the consequences of previous generations. But Indigenous people, for us, we remain focused. We remain focused on the liberties that we have been denied for hundreds of years. We remain focused on the preservation, promotion, and the perpetuation of our languages and our customs. Noam Chomsky also said, the elite dislike democracy and support it only insofar as it contributes to their social and economic objective. So what's wrong with the picture? It's up to each and every single one of you right here today to do something. It cannot be just Indigenous people. Indigenous people have been at the front lines all this time, and it is only through social media that we are getting ahead in some ways of educating people. Governments are not changing. They won't listen to us. We're not their constituents. We are the wards of the state still. They are controlling the 1886 trust fund. They're telling us how much our allowance will be for the year. It's not your taxpayers' dollars that goes into our communities. It's a trust fund that's over 100 years old. It's a trust fund that belongs to Indigenous people to rebuild those institutions that have been threatened and attacked by colonialism and imperialism. We should be able to rebuild those institutions of medicine keepers, the storytellers, the educators, the leaders. We should be able to do that, but we can't, and that's what colonialism has done. Because had we been allowed to 150 years ago, I don't think we'd be in the situation that we see today with global warming. We would have assimilated the settlers, and you would have understood how important the environment is. Your leaders today are selected by a popularity contest or whoever looks good without a shirt on. Indigenous traditional leaders are trained from very young, or at least when they're young. Most of my teachers were men, but I hung around a lot of women. My mother had 5 sisters, 6 actually, there were 7 of them, but one died when she was 8 years old. And so I've been surrounded by rich, powerful, and dignified women, honest, loving, caring, so strong that I'm able to stand here before you today. I did not give up, because in our communities, it's difficult. Where I come from, French is the priority, not English. And if you don't speak French, you don't get a job. I don't care how educated you are. And they are not telling the story about the Oka crisis properly. They're not going to talk about the thousands and thousands of human rights abuses, of torture by the police and the Canadian military, of men with cigarette burns on their bodies. They're not going to talk to you about these veterans who fought for Canada and were roughed up by the Sûreté Québec. And they're going to say it's the warriors. I'm not a warrior. I never held a gun, and yet I faced, along with many other people in my community, men who had guns and had tanks, were sitting in tanks that had cannons and could have blown us away. I am not a warrior. It was the community, not the warrior society, who put that barricade up. It's time that after 26 years the truth be told. Because I've heard ad nauseum people who call themselves warriors, but they're not really warriors. And today, we are all warriors in a way. But we are fighting a machine, we are fighting a bureaucracy, we are fighting the rich, privileged who can afford to buy off the police and the military. And it's the institutions of Canada that continue to oppress. The Magna Carta, 800 years old, is supposed to be the greatest thing that was ever written for people, human beings. It didn't apply to Indigenous people until very recently. The Magna Carta said, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law." To me, those were hollow words, because none of my ancestors were ever given that privilege. And today, Indigenous people still don't get that privilege, because under the Canadian Constitution Act, in Section 35, Indigenous people's rights are not defined, so we have to go to your courts to define them. What is wrong with this picture? And so if we decide that one day we are going to love one another and we're going to actually make this relationship work instead of being in a separation, then we're going to live, all of us, sustainably. We're all going to have the right to food. We're all going to have the right to water. You have to change the system. This is an institution. It's a powerful institution. You have to change this institution to become more honest about Canada's colonial and genocidal history, and to recognize the rights of Mother Earth in all our relations. Because this is So I want to thank you. I know I probably am gone over my time. It's a great honor again to be here. We're just touching the tip of the iceberg on what those issues are that really matter. But climate change is about all of us. That means every single one of us has a responsibility to be a responsible consumer and to not let Microsoft, Apple, or the oil companies and Walmart tell us that we need things, when what we need is water, food, love, a roof over our heads, and the ability to be able to think for ourselves. So, Nyakoa,